Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the fantastic turnout. We've done enough talking now. So what I'm going to do is just get on and do a very brief introduction of our three speakers. And I really do welcome Malcolm, Chris, and Stuart. And I do know that they put a great amount of effort both into solving the problem for Stanford, but also coming here and giving this presentation, and they put a lot of work into the presentation as well. So thanks very much. Malcolm Lee on my left here, your right, is a geologist. He was a Rhodes graduate, and he's got more than 35 years experience in exploration and exploitation of mineral deposits, particularly carbonate rocks for purposes of cement, lime, and aggregate production, the really important stuff that builds buildings and roads and all of that. So that's Malcolm's experience. Please, at the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions, and feel free to talk to the experts who are talking to you today. Stuart Dunsmore was educated at the University of Natal, so he went to a really smart university. Is a chartered engineer and a hydrologist with over 37 years of international experience in flood risk management, climate adaptation, and sustainable water solutions. Really important stuff for all of us and our future. And then Chris James is a professor emeritus in the School of Civil Engineering and Environmental Engineering at Wits University, where he has taught hydrology and hydraulics and carried out research in river hydraulic sedimentation, hydraulic structures, and environmental flows. That's just a synopsis. I'm not going to take up more time. We can certainly give you this document if you want more background on these three esteemed gentlemen. But I'm going to hand over to Malcolm. He's going to kick off and introduce the topic and the gents that are going to follow him. So thanks to you all for making yourself available.
Thanks, John. Welcome, guys. I'm going to be as quick as possible, about 5 minutes, because I know that Chris and Stuart have done a hell of a lot of work on this. And basically, I just wanted to give a feeling for what it was like when that flood hit us so early in the morning on the 23rd of September 2023. So this is early in the morning. So what I do is I take my dog for a walk very early in the morning, because he doesn't get on very well with other dogs at all. He's not at all socialized. He's a typical Joburg dog, and loves barking at the gate, but loves people to bits, but doesn't get on with other dogs. So we walk very early in the morning. So we sat up from about 5 o'clock through to 6 o'clock. It was still raining, and he was looking at me with this sort of look on his face. At 6 a.m., electricity failed. My partner Sharon was busy doing some tumble drying or washing or something, and I thought, oh dear, she's done it again. And the electricity in the house blacked out. I went to the garage and just saw the water rising in the garden, and I thought, what is going on? It was an absolute shock for me, and rushed back inside, shut the front door, struggled like hell to open it about 30 seconds later, because the pressure of the water trying to come in the door was so great that I really struggled to open it. Eventually got it open, and the water just piled in. So that was the water rising. I'll show you now where we ran upstairs, and we could look out over what was originally the Sillery Street Road. So the road running past our front gate. This is kindly from Chris, shows the Klein River, which on the left-hand side, which is, sorry, your right-hand, on the left-hand side, which is very similar, very, very friendly and a lovely place to live, really attractive place to live. But on the right, it shows what happened on the 23rd of September. That house there that you can see, let me just get the pointer. That house there is just the tip of the roof sticking out on the top. This happened in a very short period of time, around about half an hour to 40 minutes. And this also came from Chris, taken from his front veranda. The water rose when Chris's house, just ankle sort of height, on my house, about this height. But it does show what the risk of people who didn't have double-story houses, what sort of risk they were in. And we got one lady, she's about that tall, living 2 houses away from us, and she was in a single-story house and under serious threat of drowning in her own home. Our neighbors were rescued. On the left-hand side there, Gavin and Debbie were rescued. That's my car, which is a Fortuna. And the boat was moored onto the back of my Fortuna on the roof rack as they helped Gavin and Debbie escape from their single-story home. Just thanks must go out to those rescue personnel who did a fantastic job helping us. On the right-hand side, this comes from the Checkers advert, which they screened probably about a month after the flood, but they took some examples of some of the trauma that people went through. The devastation, as seen the next morning, was total. On the top left, you have my stoop area. Everything washed out of the house as the water receded, and the silt that was in the garden, which is the middle top picture, shows the amount of silt that was deposited when the waters receded. There's about 4 centimeters. That's about that much of silt. So you can imagine over millions of years how that can become a massive amount of silt. My trailer was inundated. My car, which was in the garage, was inundated. My workbench, which probably weighs about 400 kilograms, floated around. And the bedrooms, toilets, the scullery area was all inundated with silt. Much emotional trauma was caused. This just shows the elevation of the flood, which was right up in that sort of area there. That was the height of the water. An amazing amount of electronic equipment still worked after the flood, which was quite amazing. However, afterwards I found out that seawater and fresh water are very different when it comes to eroding electrical machinery. Just some asides and thanks. We went up into the mezzanine area and looked out of the window, and we could see water flushing down the Sillery Street road. And we saw a car which was washed down. It contained a well-known South African sports journalist, his wife, and their dog. And the wife refused to get out the car because when she was going to be rescued, unless they took her dog as well. And they ended up taking all 3 of them in the boat, and the car was caught up in a tree, and they were safely removed. Children floating down the river. 2 children with luckily for them, flotation vests on. They tried to escape from their house with their parents on a canoe, and the canoe had capsized. The parents were saved from our wall, and the children were saved from a tree which is just below our house. A boat, one of these big inflatable boats, collapsed, capsized, and collapsed up against a tree. And the people in the boat had to be saved, had to be rescued. The elderly, some of you might know who I'm talking about, stayed right at the end of Sillery Road, a lady of over 75 years old. Her husband was on a birding trip, and she saw the rooks flying off from the reeded area of the river. And immediately she packed up her overnight kit and went and stayed with her daughter, who was staying at Stanford Hills over the road, safe area. And their house was totally devastated. Solar power. If I just show this, that is the solar power batteries down at the bottom there. The message simply being, if you're living in a flood risk area, elevate your batteries as high as you can. And these batteries have been elevated right up to above where the inverter is now. And then, of course, silt. The amount of silt that is generated is quite frightening. So obviously, water bill of Stanford rose dramatically over that period when everyone was washing silt out of their house. There were around about 120 houses which were affected by the flood. But thanks to Chris and Stuart for their expertise and for all the work that they've done in helping people to feel safer in their house. It's amazing having an early warning system, how it is relaxing on the mind of a lot of people who were highly traumatized during this flood, which is similar to a home invasion that we are used to from the Gauteng area, from where I come. But thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Malcolm. As Malcolm said, a lot of people were affected, not as traumatically as Malcolm, but there was a lot of distress about what had happened and a lot of anxiety about what might happen again in the future. And Stuart and I are in Stanford. Stuart and I know a bit about floods, me just academically, but Stuart has a lot of practical experience. So we got together and started working on some sessions to see if we could address some issues that were of concern to the residents. And we're going to focus today on 3 of those. First is risk assessment. How bad was that flood actually? Is it likely to happen again? Secondly, mitigation measures. If and when it happens again, is there anything we can do before then that would reduce the damage that was caused? And thirdly, an early warning system. People want to know fairly soon before the flood peak hits when it's going to happen so that they've got a chance to get out. If the last flood had peaked 6 hours earlier in the dark, there would certainly have been fatalities. So we really do need that. So we need to have some sort of objective, measurable way of characterizing how serious the flood was. And we do that by characterizing a flood by its probability of occurrence. And that's what we talk about when we talk about things like the 100-year flood or the 50-year flood or the 10-year flood. That is just a way of expressing the probability. The return period or recurrence interval is just the reciprocal or 1 over the probability that that event or magnitude of that event would occur in any particular year. So a 100-year flood has a probability of 1 over 100 or 1%. 50-year flood, probability of 1 over 50, which is a 2% chance, and a 10-year flood, a probability of 1 over 10 or 10% chance of happening in any particular year. And that's very important because the return period is a bit of an unfortunate way of expressing the probability, because people seem to think, oh, if we had the 100-year flood, we'll be okay for another 99 years. It's not like that. That is wrong. It's like playing dice. If you throw a 6, the next time you throw, the chances of getting a 6 is exactly the same as it was before. You don't have to throw 5 times before you get a 6 again, and you might get 3 in a row. So you've got to interpret the probabilities like that. But those return periods are used to demarcate flood-prone areas, and they are drawn as flood lines on topographical maps. And these are the flood lines in Stanford. And you can see, where are we? 10-year flood line, the 50-year flood line, and the 100-year flood line. So there are several houses, quite a few houses below the 10-year flood line over there, and many houses below the 50-year flood line. So we can use then the return period as a measure of how bad the flood was. And we decided we're going to look at that, try and establish the return period of the 2023 flood. And we looked at different ways of doing that. The first was to compare the actual inundation that occurred with the flood lines that had already been established. Secondly, we did a frequency analysis of measured river flood water levels. And thirdly, we did a statistical frequency analysis of the rainfall in the catchment. And I'll just go through each of those. One of the residents, Bernie Oberholzer, went around after the flood and he mapped exactly where the flood went to. And quite coincidentally, it was almost exactly on the 100-year flood line. So that suggests that it was pretty serious. It was round about the 100-year flood. But we can't take that too seriously because those flood lines are not intended for this sort of interpretation. They are official lines that are supposed to be used for planning. Whether or not they're used for planning is another question, but that's what they're there for. So they're not there to make interpretations about flood severity. Also, when they were established, certain assumptions had to be made about the state of the catchment, the state of the river, and those assumptions may not be applicable anymore. And lastly, they were based on data, I suspect the data up to about 2002 to be optimistic. The flood lines were done in 2008. The data is old. The techniques, the technology that was used is outdated, and it's high time that those flood lines were redrawn to get a better idea. The best way of estimating flood probabilities is to use measured streamflow data. And there are a lot of weirs like this one. This is the one on the Klein River, about 10 kilometers upstream of Stanford. There are lots of these throughout the country, and they work by measuring the water level continuously in that little instrument house there. And then there is what we call a rating relationship from which you can convert a water level into a flow rate. Now, there used to be 3 weirs like this in the Klein River catchment. In recent years, this is the only one that's been operating. The instruments were damaged beyond repair in the 2023 flood. So from now, we are getting no more official data for flows in the Klein River catchment. The other problem that we had with this is that it only rates for very low flows. We have 61 years of record. It was opened in 1963. It does only rate for the low flows. It wasn't intended for measuring floods, but for low flows. We do, however, have records of the flood levels. And even though the instruments were destroyed in 2023, going back to that site afterwards, there were flood lines that were measurable, and we could use a level for 2023. So we can't analyze the flow data, and so we did a statistical analysis rather on the water level data, which is a little bit iffy because the relationship between water level and flow is not straightforward, but that's the best we can do. And that's how we did the analysis. On the vertical axis is the water levels measured at the gauge, and on the bottom is the return period. So those are the maximum water levels in every year. So we've got 63 data points there, and for each of those, we can fairly easily calculate a return period. We then plot those on that graph, and we can then fit a curve, a line through the upper part of the data, and from that, we can estimate where the 2023 flood would fall on that curve, and we get an estimate of 69 years. So that analysis says the return period of that flood was 69 years. Now, it's a fairly short record, so the next thing we did was to try and analyze rainfall data. And we identified 5 South African Weather Service stations within the catchment, and we also had resident data for Stanford itself. Now, SOARS doesn't just give out their data, they sell it. To get the data we wanted would have cost us 360,000 rands. And that is beyond the capabilities of Stanford residents. But fortunately, Stuart's got a silver tongue, and he managed to persuade the SOARS to give us the data just for a handling fee of about 15,000 rands. And that was manageable by Stanford. One of the residents put up that money, and so we got that data. On that map, the numbers next to each of the points is the number of years of data that they have for that particular station. The data we have are daily, so we have about 230,000 numbers to play with. The first thing we had to do was to get 2-day rainfall rather than 1-day rainfall. And the reason for that is that very large storms can extend across from one day to the next. So we need to analyze the 2-day rainfall. So every one of those daily points, we added to it the value for the previous day. And that gave us records for the 2-day rainfall for each of those stations. We did an analysis similar to the one for the flood levels for every one of those stations, but we didn't like the results very much because the highest values of rainfall didn't correlate very well with the highest flood levels that we were getting from the gauge. And the reason for that is that the rainfall is not uniform over the catchment, and each gauge is measuring a different rainfall. So we used a technique to get an aerial average for the whole catchment. And there are standard ways of doing that. So we were confident about this one because it did have a very good correlation or reasonable correlation with the river gauge levels. So we assumed that it was now representative of the rainfall for the whole catchment. The value for the 2023 storm was 143 millimeters over those 2 days. So we did the same sort of analysis. Here we've got the 2-day rainfall on the vertical axis, the return period on the horizontal axis, again extrapolating through the highest points, and that gives us a return period of 127 years. Now that's a little bit different from what we got from the flow gauge. So I repeated the analysis for a period of the rain, a selection of the data for just the same period as the river gauge was measuring, 63 years, which was exactly the same. And for that, I got a value of 54 years. And that's not that different from what we were getting from the flow data. Right, so this is what we've got. If we compare with the flood lines, it's bad. It's probably around about 100-year flood, but a little bit doubtful about the validity of that. From the water gauge levels, we get 69 years. From the total rainfall record, 127 years. And from the frequency analysis of the 2-day rain, for the same period as the gauge levels, we get 54. Now, the 54 and the 69, as I said, I don't think are terribly different. But those two are both quite different from the one for the whole rainfall record. So if you assume that a long record is better than a short one, then the return period of that flood was in excess of 100 years, around about 130 years. However, there's a big assumption underlying this sort of analysis, and that is what we call stationarity. And stationarity says that data, the statistical characteristics of data do not change with time. If we took the average and the standard deviation over some period years ago, it would be the same now, and it would be the same in the future. In other words, we're assuming that the future is going to be the same as the past. And this is a big problem in these sort of analysis because very often there is non-stationarity in the data. And that can be caused by land use changes. If there's urbanization or agricultural development, it changes the relationship of the rainfall to the flow. Dam construction, obviously that's going to change the flow conditions. We know that there are periodic changes in climate. There are cycles of drought and high flows. There is progressive climate change going on, and also ways in which the data are measured. Used to be a farmer who'd get up in the morning, if he remembered, he'd go and check the rain gauge. Now it's all telemetered and we get it automatically. So there are high possibilities for non-stationarity. For our data, there is very significant non-stationarity. This is the data for the river gauge. Again, gauge level, the water level on the vertical axis, and the maximum annual value for every year from 1963 to 2023 on the horizontal axis. I demarcated the year 1990 just as a split between the past and the present, and I've also indicated the 10-year magnitude of the values. Now, it's obvious that things have changed because since 1990, there have been 6 rainstorms with frequencies greater than the 10-year event. In the previous 30 years, not one. So things look like they have got worse in recent years. The same thing we can pick up in the rainfall data. This is our rainfall record for 148 years. And again, I've marked the 1990 position and the 10-year flood. Of the 10 highest storms in the last 148 years, 7 occurred after 1990 and only 3 before 1990. There have been 8 storms greater than the 10-year return period since 1990 and only 6 in the more than 100 years before 1990. So it looks as though things are definitely changing. I used 1990 as a separation point because there seems to be general consensus that that year is about when the effects of climate change, modern climate change, are discernible. That's why I've split that between the two. Here I've got the same graph at the top, but at the bottom I've got the annual rainfall for the same period. And you can see that the annual rainfall looks quite stationary, whereas the storm occurrence is very non-stationary. And that seems to coincide also with views of climate change. The total amount of rain isn't changing, but it's happening in very extreme events. So we do suspect that there is certainly non-stationarity and probably climate change. So what do we do as planners? It's very difficult now to plan for the 100-year event or the 50-year event. What I've got here is those frequency curves for different periods. The blue curve is the one that we've been using. That is the total record up to 2023. The green curve is up to 2002, because as I said, I think that's probably the data set that we used for calculating the flood lines in 2008. And then the red one is up to 1990. Right, our maximum rainfall, 143 millimeters over 2 days. I said if you look at the blue curve, 127-year return period. If that same storm had occurred in 1990, and I had done the analysis, I would have concluded the return period to be greater than 300 years. And in 2002, when the flood lines were determined, a return period greater than 200 years. So if we take the whole record, 120 years, 130 years, up to 1990, over 300 years, and 2022, over 200 years. So what do we do? Just before leaving that, in 2022, if an engineer had looked and done an analysis to get the 100-year storm rainfall, he would have got 127 millimeters. If we use the curve up to 2023, that same storm would have a return period of only 58 years. So what is now the 100-year flood line in Stanford is probably, if it were redone, probably more like the 50-year flood line. All the flood lines are now going to be higher. Right, so our conclusions is definitely non-stationarity, and we think that it's most likely associated with progressive climate change. Very difficult to put a number to the return period of the 2023 flood, but we think that the risk of flooding is going to be greater in the future than it was in the past. What to do? From my reading, it seems that planners are now not using a single return period to plan for, but they're looking rather at the probability that an event would occur, P, over a certain period of time, depending on the recurrence interval or return period that is assumed. And that return period can then be changed and updated depending on data available. Using that equation, I drew up this little graph. Got return period in the first column, the period of years along the top, and all those numbers in the middle are the percent probability of a flood occurring. So if you want to retire in Stanford and you buy a house below the 10-year flood line and you're planning to live there for 10 years, then you have a 65% chance that you'll be flooded during that time. If you live close to the 100-year flood line, that flood line as it is, you've got about a 10% chance of being flooded in the next 10 years. But as I've said, I think the risk is now greater. What was the 100-year flood line is now closer to the 50-year flood line, which means that your risk is probably nearly double what it used to be. Right. That's a bit depressing because we can't actually have any definite answers. So what we started next was looking at what are we going to do? The chances of flooding are increasing. Is there anything that we can do to alleviate the consequences of the flood? Floods start ultimately with rain falling on the catchment. Hydrological processes in the catchment transform that rainfall into flow rates. The flow into river, depending on the hydraulic conditions, manifest as flow depths and velocities. And the flow depth is an indicator of the water level. So we want to change the water level. There's very little we can do about the rain. Certainly at the moment, we can't do much about that. But we can do things about the transformation of the rain to runoff. We can provide storage in the catchment. Building a dam is probably not feasible. It would probably cost more to build a dam than to buy all the properties in Stanford and relocate them. So that's probably not economically feasible. We could perhaps build smaller structures that would divert floodwater onto agricultural land during the time of a flood. Or, and I hesitate to say, maybe encourage lots and lots of regrowth upstream in the rivers. So, limited actions in the catchment. In the river, there are things that we can do, and that's what I will be talking about. We can modify the river and change that behavior. But the water level in a river depends on three things. One we call the channel conveyance, which is just the capacity of the channel to convey the flow rate that is introduced into it. And we can change that. If we make the channel wider, the water level will be lower. If we make the flow faster, the water level will be lower. And we can make it faster again by changing the alignment of the river or clearing away obstacles, clearing away vegetation, and so on. So there are possibilities there. Less obvious is the effect of downstream conditions. And the flow, the water level at any point in a river depends on the local conveyance, but also on what happens downstream. An extreme case would be construction of a dam downstream. But just the Klein River entering the estuary would also have an effect because the slope becomes less, there's more vegetation, and so the water level is backed up. That backing up extends a long way upstream, not just to the level of the water at the backing up, but higher than that and for a long way upstream. So if you are looking for measures close to where the backing up occurs, at that position, what I call downstream control, if you want to change the water levels there, then you must look at what's happening downstream. If you're a long way upstream, then you look at what's happening in the channel and try and change the channel conveyance. And Stanford sort of falls somewhere in the middle. The water levels are affected both by the channel conveyance and by what happens downstream. Stuart will explain some of that right the way down to the mouth of the estuary. Right, how do we actually test any of the effects and modifications that we can make? We're using software called HEC-RAS, the American Army Corps of Engineer software. And the first thing we needed was a description of the terrain. And we got that from LiDAR surveys and from bathymetry. LiDAR measures the topography above the water level, and bathymetry is a survey of the river channel below the water level. Combining those two, we get a digital terrain model like this. And we can modify that. And that's how we can introduce changes. We can change that topography in the model and see what effect it would have. On top of that, we've got a Google satellite image of the town, so we can see exactly where things are. And Malcolm's house is right there. So that's where that devastation occurred. Another thing to notice before I get onto the model is have a look at all the reeds, very extensive reeds all the way along the left bank of the river. And then another layer necessary for the model described the surface of the land, because the roughness of the surface depends how quickly or determines how quickly the water is going to flow over it. So we identified about 100 different areas and defined a roughness characteristic for each of those. And then as input to the model, we need the flows. This is a hydrograph that Stuart produced from hydrological modeling. And this is the hydrograph that we think happened for the 2023 flood. Hydrograph is just a relationship between the flow rate on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. So the flow increases to a peak and then decreases. The peak there is 1,150 cubic meters per second. Now that is about equivalent to an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 2 seconds. 1 second, 2 seconds. Olympic pool going through in that period of time. So it's very high flows. This is the model running. Okay, there comes the water flowing down. Now, just watch one thing, watch how the water flows into Stanford. Okay, and so Stanford residents watch this and they can see their houses. Where's Malcolm's house gone? Right. Right, and this shows all the velocities. Okay. Okay, so you can see all the velocities, and you can see the flow going down the streets. And what I'd like you to notice, one thing is where I identified the reeds in the previous one, there's very little flow there, and the flow has been deflected onto the floodplain, and you can see that very large here. That's where the flow is. This is where all the reeds were. And one other thing I'd like to show you is how the flow enters Stanford. Okay, it's coming up. If you look here, a lot of the residents said that the water came from that direction. It didn't come directly from the river. So it came through and down the main roads. And that's what hit Malcolm, yeah. Okay, what I showed in the simulation, that's just showing the velocities down the channel, bypassing the reeds, going down the roads. And that just shows the entry from that point, which is relevant for something I'll show later. Okay, we tried various mitigation measures. These were all just concept changes, just choosing fairly arbitrary dimensions and directions and so on. And these are the measures that we tried. Reed clearing, which is already happening. People are anticipating that it's going to have an effect. We tried landscaping the floodplain. We tried dredging the river channel, and we tried some levee construction. Right, the first thing was reeds. And again, the reeds, I cleared the reeds all the way on the left bank, all the way down past Stanford. And I took those reeds out, but just by changing the surface roughness. And the effect that it had was very little for the 2023 year flood. Pale green that you can just see on the fringes, that's the level for the 2023 year flood. And the brown, which is actually pink just on top of the green, is with the reeds cleared. So very little effect for a very high magnitude flood. But Stuart also produced some design hydrographs for different return periods. And that's what happened with the 50-year flood hydrograph. And you can see there are many houses that are now protected just by clearing the reeds. All of those houses would be protected for lower floods. These houses here, tough luck, they're not protected at all. Right, the second option we looked at was landscaping the floodplain. And we looked at these two areas of floodplain, that one and that one. And I lowered the ground level by about 1 meter over that whole area. And again, very little change for the 2023 year flood, but the same sort of significant change for lesser floods. That's for about the 50-year flood. Channel dredging, if you look at the left slide, once the reeds were cleared, it was apparent there's a lot of sediment deposition in the channel. And if we take that sediment out, we will be increasing the channel conveyance. So to simulate that, I put in a channel all the way from the bridge down to that corner there, about a 50-meter wide channel, which represents the river without all that sediment removed. Again, very little effect for the major flood, the 2023 flood, and the same sort of effect for the lesser flood. Last one was building a levee, and again, just to remind you of the way that the water came into Stanford, and that means that we could actually reduce the flood level just by raising the level of that road. But that would require quite a high level raising, about 1.5 meters. So instead of that, I put in an embankment all the way around like that, because that also protects those 3 houses which wouldn't have been otherwise protected. And the same story. The 2023 flood, very little except the top of the embankment is clear, but that doesn't help anybody. All right, but again, the same protection for large number of houses there, but again, nothing for these houses over here. It's not only the inundation area that is damaging, but it's also the height of the water level. And here I've taken a cross section across the valley and into Stanford, and here plotted the blue line is the flood level for the 50-year design hydrograph without any measures, the green line with reed clearance, the dark blue one with landscaping, and the red one for dredging. Bearing in mind that the dredging and the landscaping would also involve some reed clearing. So the reed clearing is really, really effective. All right, so conclusions. There's very little we can do to mitigate the damage for a flood as big as the one that we had. There are several concepts that would provide protection for lower floods for some areas, but not for all the areas in Stanford. And the reason for that is possibly because of the topography, but also possibly because of the downstream effects that I mentioned. And I think Stuart will address some of that. So that's it, Stuart, you're on.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm going to take you through some of the discussions that we've been having and some of the analysis we've been doing for the downstream area, because as Chris has shown, that water level at the lower end of Stanford does limit the performance, the hydraulic performance of the system, especially for the large floods. And we wanted to see whether we could actually get any gain out of that system. So before I start, I just want to make mention of the hydrological model. I mean, these investigations into flood events are quite layered. We deal with different systems, including the hydrological responses of catchments. Chris has spoken about the weather systems, and now we're talking about the hydraulic systems, but the hydrological model itself, we haven't really covered that much in this project, but it's fundamental to our level of analysis. So I thought we'd just make a brief mention of it so you have some background to it. You've seen the catchment in previous slides, and the river catchment area to Stanford itself is about 700 square kilometers, which is not a small catchment, but it's not a big catchment either in South African terms. And our methods for analyzing those catchments are quite well set out. What we wanted to do, though, is have a model, a computer model, that we could address those 2 key issues there. Rainfall runoff response. So once the rain hits the ground, how much of it is converted to the surface runoff, which gives us the volume of the flood. And the volume of the flood in this case, particularly for September 23, was massive. And that volume has quite a lot of impact on the performance of the hydraulic systems or the hydraulic options that we're looking at further downstream. And then we also wanted to be able to convey the flood through the catchment area. So in other words, through all of the tributaries, etc., through the system down to the point at Stanford, because that shapes the hydrograph. So you saw that sort of bell-shaped curve that Chris had on one of the earlier slides. Well, that shape is defined largely by the flow characteristics in the catchment, the streams and the tributaries that are taking the water down to the outlet. So the hydrological models are not just rainfall runoff models. They are now models that include that conveyance, and we have got one established for the system. It's been good for the flood analysis, and now as we move into the early warning assessment of these systems, this model is also going to play a role for that. But we're not going to go into much more detail on that at this stage. I just thought I'd give you a sense of what's part of that system. So I'm going to be looking at the hydraulics of the estuary area. And initially, that primary focus was going to be given to the mouth. Stanford residents are acutely aware that whether the mouth is closed or open does have an influence on the water levels in Stanford. And even when the like we have now, the mouth of the river is open, we still have that backwater effect into the lower part of Stanford. Earlier in the year, in July, when water levels had risen quite substantially because the mouth at that stage was closed before the breach early in August, the water was back right up to the R43 bridge. So it does have a material influence on the water levels in the system. So of course, if you get a flood on top of that, then there could be more serious trouble than occurred in 23. But as we got into the analysis, we realized that there was this little delta area, well, not so little, but it's a delta area in the as I've got on the slide there, where as the water filters through the channel, it reaches this more open area. The velocities drop substantially, sediment drops out, and you've got this increasing delta system that grows over time as more and more sediment comes into the system. And we were curious about how this was going to affect the flood conditions in Stanford. Would it have a material influence? So we took a closer look at it. What you see in this slide is an aerial image. So this is a flood level of flood inundation. It's not the peak of the flood that we were analyzing, but it just gives you a sense of what that delta system looks like. You can see water spreads out from the channel and goes both sides of the area before it gets into the estuary. And the depth analysis shows you quite starkly how the original channel seems to have come to an end as the sediment has blocked up the system. And now you've got these wide, shallow areas all around the side until we get water going into the deeper areas of the estuary body itself. The influence hydraulically is quite important because if you've got water flowing in a straight direction, almost laminar type flow, it's all the water molecules are flowing in one direction. You've got a fairly efficient hydraulic system. But when water starts moving in 2 dimensions or even 3 dimensions, we have largely 2-dimensional effects in river systems. Then you've got more resistance in the channel, which slows the water down, which, as Chris has shown on his graphs, actually raises the water level in the system, and that will then cause more backwater effects upstream. And you can see here, there's a substantial amount of flow breaking out of the channel, flowing sideways into the side shallow areas, and it will be flowing under higher resistance. That's the early part of the hydrograph, and as it gets deeper in the later part of the hydrograph, it's a little bit more smooth, but there's still quite a lot of lateral flow in this early part of the delta system. So what does that do for our flood levels? So there you can see a profile of the riverbed. Here you have Stanford. Here you have the R43 bridge. So the water goes, the riverbed goes through Stanford. Now this is based on the bathymetry that we have. It's not as refined as the LiDAR that Chris showed on the area around the river itself. So this is below the water level. We've got a curious profile here, which maybe the geomorphologists, if there are any in the room, would like to have a guess at how that's come about. You've got the delta area here, which is obviously where this deposition has been taking place. And then you've got a deeper area, but not as deep as some of the river systems for the main estuary body. And then I don't know if you've seen, but just before the mouth of the estuary, there's that long flat area where there's relatively shallow water for the last kilometer or two of the estuary before it actually gets to the mouth spit and then into the ocean area. So that's what we're analyzing at the moment. I can't see from the evidence that we've got available, which is only the last 20 years at most, how this area might have changed. So we don't have any clear evidence of sediment patterns expanding, as it were, in this area. But people who live along that area of the river or of the estuary say that definitely they are seeing much more wider, shallower areas emerging in the delta zone. And the yacht club has also been saying that many of their members are now complaining about the sailing conditions in the main body of the estuary because of the sediment problems. And obviously that changes as the level in the estuary rises and falls. So I hope this is not too complicated, but what these lines show is a snapshot in time as the flood wave moves from the area around Stanford through the single channel part of the estuary, over the delta area and into the main body of the estuary. And so this will be very early. This water level here will be very early in the progression of the flood. And then I've showed it at different stages as the flood level rises within the area between Stanford and the delta. So the delta here I'm using as a bit of a pivot point. But you can see on both sides of the pivot point, the water level is rising to a point where we get the maximum water level in Stanford. At this point, the red line is a continuous part of the red line coming through, but it's not the maximum level in the estuary. So you can see as the flood recedes, as it passes Stanford, you can see the water level is still rising in the estuary, but it's falling in Stanford. So the important part for us is this previous slide, where you can see that there's a clear step as it comes through the estuary area. So this indicates that there is more resistance around the estuary area, and that resistance is released as it goes through into the main body of the estuary. Sorry, there's resistance in the delta area, and that's causing higher water levels in Stanford than in obviously the estuary body itself. And as the time progresses, that lowers, and this still continues to increase. So is there an opportunity in this case to look to see whether we can reduce the resistance of this area? And you can imagine it's something quite drastic, like dredging a channel through there, as it might have been in the past, a bit more sort of open system. And no doubt there's going to be a lot of environmental questions about this kind of idea, but at this particular point in time, all we're doing is to see whether it actually will make a difference before we even go down the next line of environmental investigations. So this is going to be a discussion we have with Cape Nature and other people who are involved in that. But at this stage, we're just trying to get a feel of whether we can actually make a difference. So there's a possibility that we can, and we haven't got past this point at this stage. We're still doing these investigations. So the hydraulic resistance is there. What's also part of this picture is the volume. So at this point in time, or at least in the previous slide, the volume of the hydrograph is still coming through the system in this at this stage, and the volume has not reached this area of the estuary yet. Whereas this one, the volume has reached the estuary, and that progress of the movement of the volume through the system will also have an influence, and it may negate the benefits that we can get from improving the hydraulics through this delta area overall. So we've still got to run those tests. These simulations take quite a while to run, so it's quite tedious, and then you have to make a few changes and then rerun it again. So we're still working through that time series. But there's some hope that this might make a difference, and it might lower the water levels that Chris was talking about at the bottom end of Stanford, so that his measures that he showed actually will have a wider influence, and not just the upper part of Stanford, but actually some of the lower part of Stanford as well. We've also started an analysis where we look at the effect of breaching. So in the previous studies, when the flood took place in 2023, the mouth was open, and these analyses were based on the fact that the mouth was open. what we've then done, because particularly of the experience in the earlier part of this year where the mouth was closed and the water levels kept rising, we looked at what the conditions would be if, say, for example, so that simulation is with the mouth open. That is where the mouth spits. The spit that cuts across, cuts along the beach is at 2 meters. Then it's 3 meters, and then it's 4 meters. And you can see the impact on the lower portion of Stanford is still there. It's not massive, but it's still there, and we need to see whether we can't change that. You can see that this effect of the delta is present when the mouth is open, but as it becomes as the mouth rises, the effect of the delta diminishes. So in a mouth open scenario, it looks like the delta defines some of the flood levels in Stanford. With the mouth closed, it'll be the mouth itself that defines some of the flood levels in Stanford. And we now then need to finalize this analysis and then, as I say, take it to the powers that be to talk about the wider implications of this. Because if we do want to recommend that the mouth is breached as part of a flood management scenario, then how much earlier in the progress of the flood does one have to be to make that breach take effect? And what we did was we looked at some historic water level records in the estuary. This was a gauge station at the yacht club, and you can see over the period of time the water level rises to a point, and then there's a sudden drop in the level, which is a breach scenario. And we took a number of those events and to see what time it took to get from the peak of the breach down to this average water level of 2.2 meters that we used as a threshold measure. And you can see it varies. It varies from between events. Some of them are quite short, some within almost a day, and in other cases it took almost 3 days to actually make that to get that water level to drop. And if anybody had looked at the breach that took place in August, you can see the reasons why. It starts off with a trickle, and it slowly gets a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and then it starts to expand more rapidly. It's not like opening a gate in a dam where you pull open the gate and you've got this rush of water coming out. It actually starts and progresses over a certain period of time. And so we've got to take that time factor into account, and we've got to take the rate of drop into account as well. So we've started doing some analyses where we look at the effect of the breach, and this is probably a little difficult to see, but anyway, at the estuary mouth, we simulated the event where the spit was the September 23 event, where the spit was at a 2 meter water level, and the same again with the water level at 4 meters. And then we did run a simulation with a breach, and you can see the breach pulls it down quite nicely from the worst case scenario. We then looked at the effect of that in Stanford, and you can see that same breach. We nearly got to the maximum water level in Stanford as we would have done if the mouth hadn't breached. So we've really got to pull this breach time forward so that we can actually avoid that high peak. That actually we can get down much closer to what this flood level would have been if the mouth had already been opened. And we're there looking at a simulation time or a breach time of 33 hours. But maybe we wouldn't need it quite as long because it takes effect a little bit more. So we've got to run a few more simulations to get the scenario right. But we're getting closer to an understanding of how this is going to play out when we have those discussions with other stakeholders. So that brings us on to looking at early warning. So typically with flood relief, you look at a hydraulic solution first, because ideally what you want to do is remove the risk of flooding altogether if you can. And in previous years, where you could put a big concrete channel in place of a river system, you were more likely to achieve those kinds of solutions. But nowadays it's a lot harder, also because there's more encroachment into floodplains and a lot more land use activities closer to floodplains. So flood hydraulic solutions don't necessarily achieve the full solution. And in this case, we expect that it won't. We will hopefully achieve some hydraulic flood reduction, but we may still need something like an early warning system to manage the consequence. And this balance of risk and consequence is something that also came out of that table that Chris showed earlier, where if you are planning to stay in a risk area for a certain period of time, you can calculate the likelihood of a certain event occurring in that time period. You would apply that equation here as well, but it also depends on what the consequences are if you do get flooded. If it's your farmland that just gets inundated and you may lose some crops or something like that, maybe that's one level of risk that might have a high level of tolerance. If it's your house that goes underwater, if you listen to the story that Malcolm gave, it really is something you want to avoid altogether. So early warning might be the most important action in that case. So we use the hydrological model to start giving us a sense of what could be achieved. So typically we're getting around about a 9 to 10 hour time period between the centroid of the rainfall event and the peak. So that's a starting measure. Centroid of a rainfall event is typically is a common reference point in design flood analysis. But of course, when you're in the middle of a storm, you don't know where the centroid is because it may not have happened yet. But this is just a measure to see how much, what sort of timeframes we're talking about. So you're looking at about 9 to 10 hours. If we're looking at making sure that the warning comes through a lot earlier, because you don't want to be told that you're going to be flooded when you are being flooded. You want to be told earlier so that you can make plans around that. So in this case, if the threshold for flooding, in other words, when it starts to get close to property boundaries, you've got still, so it takes about 4 hours after the centroid of the storm, but it gives you about 6 hours potentially to do something about it before the worst of the situation occurs. Then that would be one of the targets that we would try to achieve. We can use a more detailed breakdown. So we're looking at if we have flow gauges in other locations of the catchment. So here we are in Stanford. If we had flow gauges at these points, what information would that give us? So if we have a flow gauge at J5, for example, which happens to be where that flow gauging station that Chris showed in the photograph, and where we now have a water level logger, we've got about 2 hours of lead time in a big event. If it's smaller events, it takes a little longer to come through, but if it's one of these big storms where you've got a large volume of water, it will move a lot quicker through the system. So here we're looking at about 2 hours warning, which is a bit late for us. We still need to have something earlier. So we're looking at over time, maybe putting in at least one other, if not two more gauges in the system, possibly around these locations where we've got here. We're going to supplement that with weather stations. So here's the gauging with the water level logger that we've got in. So Chris told you that Department of Water and Sanitation is no longer going to rehabilitate that weir, but we're going to use our gauge to hopefully supplement that information so we can extend the life of the record. And then we put a rain gauge as close to the center point of the catchment as we can. Now, Chris also mentioned that we don't know the distribution of rainfall, and that does have a marked effect on the volume of water that actually emerges from the catchment. But the centroid is about our best starting point. But we really need a few more weather stations in the system. But the system that we have is functioning quite nicely. Here you see the rain gauges results, and you see the water level logger that gives us the results. We're getting records coming through every 5 minutes. We can set it to what it'd be like, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. In summer, we'll probably have it at an hourly time step or something like that. But during a storm, we can shorten the recording time so we can monitor it a lot more carefully, and that will give us a sense of what's happening. So Tesla's Dole rain gauge, that will be our first warning point. And then we'll see how that progresses down into the catchment when it gets to it's approximately near Raka Winery, and then we'll know that things are happening. What we've also done, and this was an excellent study that Chris did, correlating observed water levels in Stanford at the same time that high levels were being picked up at the river gauging station near Raka. This also gives us a measure of of what we can expect. And now we've set a threshold measurement of 2.5 meters. So as soon as our gauge at Rocco measures 2.5 meters, we now know that something potentially significant is going to be coming through. We should already have an advance warning or have an expectation of this, but we will be monitoring the system to be able to tell us whether that's going to be big or not. So this is our thought process. Here we have the flood. We want to be told at 0 hours before the flood. In this case, I've said it's 6 hours. That's what we're aiming at the moment. We're hoping that our water level gauges, initially we've only got one, but we will have more, will give us another lead time of another 6 hours or thereabouts. We would like to think that our rain gauges, once they're installed, will give us an extra 3-6 hours thereabouts lead time. So all in all, we might have about 9 hours of lead time, which it also covers that day-night scenario that Chris mentioned, where that if the weather system starts coming through, say early evening, we'll start picking it up then, rather than only knowing later, sort of early hours of the morning that something dreadful is going to be happening. So we want to try and cover that as much as possible. We also want to tap into the South African weather services. I was acutely aware of what Chris was saying, that I had an interaction with South African weather services, and I hope in the context of South African dealings with government that you don't take that the wrong way. This was an above board exercise. But what we're finding is, so on the one hand, South African weather services has a policy that they need to sell data, and they find it very difficult to break that policy. But we do have scientists in South African weather services who are sympathetic to these kinds of situations. So they are trying to make arrangements for communities where these kinds of things can be done. So they already provide a long-term forecasting. We all get that. We all see that. We will utilize that as people in Stanford have certainly been doing for some time. What we want to get from South African weather services is something called the nowcasting process, whereby they provide us or somebody within the municipality, it may have to be a municipal official, they provide information from their rain gauges on an hourly basis during these severe weather conditions. So that will give us a very important spread of information for that catchment area, because at the moment we've got one gauge and we need more, and hopefully South African Weather Services will provide those other gauges, the ones that Chris showed on his plan that we had used for our analyses. We want real-time data for those gauging stations to come through to us, and that will then give us that extra buffer, the extra lead time that will give us half a day's warning before the actual event comes through. And then over and above all of that, we want to be able to initiate a breach if that's necessary, if that's going to make a difference. And at this stage, we don't yet know how effective that's going to be, and at this stage, we don't know exactly when that will be. But we've already tried to open the door with Cape Nature to say that what happens if the time to breach is before the rain has actually fallen, which is going to be quite a tricky thing, because if the lead time is more than 24 hours, for example, so once you initiate the breach, it takes 24 hours before the water levels drop sufficiently to really make a difference in Stanford. Then how is that going to be accepted? Probably not nicely in the beginning, but maybe with a bit of discussion, we can come out with some agreement on that if it takes place. So we're trying to sort of engage at this stage, even though we don't have the final results. We want to be able to have those discussions meaningfully to make sure that we've got those areas covered. That really, I think, is all that I wanted to say. This is just a bit of a structure of what we are looking at in terms of Stanford's early warning system. We're going to have a control center, which might be the community policing forum, who are going to be monitoring the rain gauges and the water level loggers. Chris and I and one other member of the community are also looking at those loggers over time. We don't really want to run these hydrological models as they do in more advanced early warning systems. We don't think we need that at the moment, but it's a possibility if we do need it down the line. And then we want those nowcasting records to come through to the community or to the control center And over time, we will develop an understanding of what the thresholds really are for floods coming into the Stanford environment. So there's a bit of trial and error, and that's not unusual with early warning systems. But when you're dealing with it at a community funded level, we have to do it step by step. And that's all I really wanted to say. As I said in the beginning, the process is quite convoluted. We're working with different natural systems, hydrological, the weather, the hydraulic, and often we get feedback from those systems that are contradictory to what we got for the previous analysis, and we have to run through the situation again. So it's been quite a time-consuming process, and in addition to that, we've had to wait for data to come through that enable us to do the analysis to a certain level of confidence. So I think we've got there. We've just got a few more weeks, I think, to tidy up the report, and then it should be coming out for everyone to see. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much to everyone. Even at the front here, I'm sure there's some questions.
I just wanted to understand whether you considered or evaluated the likelihood of false alarm.
False alarms. Yeah, it's a real possibility, especially when you're dealing with information that doesn't necessarily translate to a flood. So we have to manage the message to the communities very carefully. We want to give them an alert, but we certainly want to have a trial phase. So the community's got to be aware that we're in a trial phase. We might be initiating, we might be sending out alerts, and we will need them to understand how that plays out. We ourselves have to be quite proactive. We've got to give feedback. We've got to give them an understanding of what we were trying to do at that stage. So they will know that when we go into it, we are not 100% certain. Yeah, but false alarms are a worry because people start forgetting, it's just another alarm, it's we don't have to worry about it.
Peter?
That was excellent. So thank you to all three of you. And I certainly hope that you write it up, maybe even put it into a professional some way anyway. And it's interesting to hear what you're planning to do. That point of view, because I think it has wider use for other communities elsewhere in the country as well, to know what you've done in the solution. My question to you is just, what sort of cooperation did you get from the authorities, not from the weather services, but from local municipality? Are they willing to engage with you, and have they agreed to actually take it on board into the municipal system?
Can you just repeat that question so that our online people can hear what it was?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the question was, how much are the municipalities participating with us in this whole process? It's actually not just the municipalities. I mentioned Cape Nature. We're part of the Klein River Estuary Forum that meet on a quarterly basis. They're listening to these kinds of discussions. And as I said, we're trying to sensitize them to the outcomes. Municipalities, I don't know, if you want a diplomatic answer, maybe I should hand it over to Chris. If you don't want a diplomatic answer, then I think you'll have to switch the microphone off. Okay, so I think the problem at the moment is that if the responsibility on municipalities, if you're working according to the National Water Act, the responsibility is to make sure that communities are aware of risks like flooding, and of course they've done their flood lines, which Chris showed, and we've got a big event which ties up very well with one of their flood lines, but obviously development has been allowed to take place within the floodplain. So that is a scenario which I don't think has really been aired. I'm not aware that it's been aired within the municipality itself, but I think it's an area that we need to sort of go softly with them to to try to get them to engage in terms of a liability level. I need to be careful about really what I mean by that. There's no legal intent. It's a case of making sure that they understand their responsibilities. We do know that they want to participate. I mean, they were very good in the flood to initiate the disaster scenario. So only they can make those decisions, and they did that, as far as I understand, pretty well. But this issue of having development in a floodplain that they knew was in a floodplain, I think, is going to be quite a challenging one to deal with over time. But they have individuals who are actively monitoring water levels. So when there is a flood, some of their staff, they go through the night. They go and they observe. They will report back to the community that the flood, the water level at the bridge is so much, and it's all okay, or whatever the case may be. And there's an intention that we present this when we've sort of got a lot more confidence in what we really want to say in terms of the solutions, that they will then initiate this as part of their disaster management functions. But I do think that and it's not just municipalities here; it's across the country that they are not engaging with this level of risk. And this, in fact, IMESA has been running a campaign in conjunction with the Water Research Commission over 2 years now, I think, where they've been going around to municipalities to try to get them to understand the whole issue around design flood estimation and flood risk and water flood lines liabilities. There's a big section on flood liabilities. Prof. Cobus du Plessis from Stellenbosch University has drafted a very useful summary of what the legislative requirements are for this kind of thing, and he's pointing his fingers at them and saying, you've got to really take account of what's going on here. I think there's a level of expertise that's missing that would actually allow them to engage with it on their own initiative.
It goes exactly to that. It's about competency, which simply isn't there. We're supposedly better than the rest, but it's not even here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a summary of what the situation, as I see it.
Are you in touch with the people on the Honors River project in terms of their measures that they're taking with restoring the estuary, etc.? And are you talking to them at all?
Members of the Stanford Conservation Group are in touch with them. They are looking at the establishment of a committee, I think, that ONRUS has set up, which Stanford is wanting to use as a model. Is that right? Something along those lines. Yeah, we haven't really engaged with them in terms of the actual flood dynamics. And interestingly, one of our South African Weather Services stations at Tussonbayda is in their catchment, and it is the highest recording station in this set of stations that we've been analyzing. So it looks like that's a high risk area, because I think a lot of the historic data is also at Tussonbayda showing, it's the high. So yes, there could be some technical collaboration there. We haven't got into that. John.
Yeah, I'm just going to take you back a little bit of history. Not even recent, not even human history for most of us, but your profile, and you sort of said, not sure what that is in the upstream of the delta. To me, immediately that said, water levels are lower, sea level is lower. If you look at, and we know that 120,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, sea level was 130 meters below current, way out in the Agulhas Plain. The bathymetry of Walker Bay, I believe, clearly shows an extended channel for the Klein River, going way out probably another 50 or so kilometers down into Walker Bay. Since then, sea level has been rising. So as sea level rises, water flow is less, so everything coming down is slowed soon and soon. So this sediment buildup has been happening since then. And
walk up front, please. I hear what you say from Ryan.
Yeah, I'm just referring back to the last glacial maximum, 70 and 120,000 years ago, when sea level was 120 meters lower, way out near Gullis Bank. And this channel upstream of the delta has since been filling up as sea level's been rising. So of course sediment is slowed down, and this is slowly migrating at, not within human time, upstream. And so the expectation would be that that delta, you can dredge it whatever you do, but in geological time it's going to fill up. So that's it's not a solution, but it's a long-term observation that just seemed to look about.
Well, that's the kind of input we need actually, is that perspective, because I mean it's a curious profile.
Yeah.
And that helps a lot. Thanks.
Yeah. I think the thing would be to know is how deep is bedrock?
Yeah.
Yeah, because there'll be a lot of sediment there.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a pre-promo. I hope to give us a talk on the geological history of the Onrus River, which perhaps indicates, knowing where bedrock is, indicates what the actual total profile of the river is and how long it's taken to build up that sediment. But it's at least 70,000 years.
We don't have the records.
May I make a comment?
Very quick.
Die man die mense wil hoor wat
Kom speak.
Kom staan.
No, you will repeat it. Just does it high tide, low tide, does it make a difference?
As far as we can tell, high tide and low tide doesn't really make much difference. The levels don't seem to get close to it doesn't seem to have any material impact. I think it might reach inland quite a bit, but I think the other factors are more overriding at this point in time.
Even the windbacks probably more than I don't get it.
And if I can just add a further question, Stuart. I mean, when you drive up to Tesla's Dal, you mentioned it, and look at the Klein River upstream. I mean, the poor farming practices are immense, and you talk about the estuary. The estuary undoubtedly is silting, and it was spectacular, sadly, in the Bot River, in that same system, where that, it washed away just the approaches to the bridge, not the bridge itself. But that sediment load that was dropped there suddenly was like a meter below the bridge, whereas previously when you look down the bridge, it was 3 or 4 meters lower. And remember, somewhere down the bot, there's still a vehicle with sadly a youngster in it that was lost, washed off the bridge. One of those youngsters got out the vehicle. But poor farming practices are a huge problem. And if you drive the Renosterveld, you can see that many of the farmers, not all of them, are cleaning the slopes down into the little gullies. So those gullies no longer have bush or plant life to actually slow that flow. And so the silting, be it the Klein or the Bot, it's scary.
Yeah.
And somehow, we've got to get back to the landowners too and make them do their bit.
Yes, well, catchment.
That's the bigger.
Yeah, certainly catchment management planning is something that we need to do in these catchments. But that's another process in itself, but it's important. Yeah.
Ask quickly, DU coming into Play Street. Did that interfere with the water coming from the river? Because we had a big flood in Queen Victoria Street and Flay Street. The houses were all flooded and all there.
Yes, so that was a backwater effect. So that Flay, the area around Flay Street was inundated because of the river. So it came up the Flay. And caused the flooding of those properties along there. The work, I think, was fairly insignificant, to be honest, in that event. The other factor would be that the work or that small catchment would have discharged through the system a lot earlier anyway. So the timing would have been different.
Can you stop the deal from coming? Can you detour it to somewhere else.
We
To
wouldn't
your
want.
neighbours you are.
Yeah, no, we wouldn't want to do anything like that. No, no. I mean, just to put it into context, the other question that was raised by communities in Stanford was that what happened, because there were some dams upstream that failed, and we had a look at those dams, and in terms of volume, they are tiny compared to the volume of this flood. So really, systems like Diepwoog, local farm dams makes hardly any difference. You won't see the difference.
On a lighter note, on one of the first slides in that flooding area of Stanford, there was a guitar case
Floating down the river.
floating down the river. Apparently that guitar
Oh, no.
case belonged to somebody in this room. Could you quickly recount what happened to that guitar case at the end of the day?
Can I speak to you very quickly? I've just seen that guitar case, guitar case floating down the river. I think on my first or second slide. Oof, I'll never find it.
Let's talk again.
Okay, but what actually happened was that the guitar case floated out as the water was subsiding in the house. It floated out the front door, out onto the street, and floated down the street. Floated all the way down through the lagoon into the waves at Grotto Beach, and was picked up by a guy by the name of Mr. Vermaak, who very kindly found out that it was our guitar case. Well, sorry, we found out that he had a guitar, and we knew that we'd lost a guitar. So we contacted him, and he came into Stanford. He brought us the guitar, he brought us fruit, he brought us flowers. Very, very kind man. And he brought a chair, which somebody else had lost, which somebody found out that we had and came and fetched it from us, and we gave it relatively kindly to them. But just the community spirit that this flood actually brought out in people was quite amazing, and we're very thankful for everyone who did help us. Thank you.
Okay, no more questions.
Yeah, Lisa did
I'll speak loudly. Klein River, I understand, falls under the Breeder Catchment Management Agency of Water Affairs. Is Water Affairs involved at all with looking at this?
Didn't get a just repeat the question.
So the question was, the Klein River system falls under the Breeder River Catchment Management Agency, and has Department of Water and Sanitation been involved? We've had some very good support from Department of Water and Sanitation with regards to the flood conditions, the gauging stations and things like that. We haven't had much input from the, is it the acronym BOCMA or something, the Breeder Catchment Management Agency. We haven't had much from them at this point in time. I know the contact has been made with them, but I think we need to go to them with a bit more substance. I mean, we're getting to that point now where they will, I think, start being more interested.
Okay, no more questions. Right. So I would just like to thank the three speakers, and we do have a little contribution for the three of them. So thanks very much. And I guess the only comment I have is watch the space, because presumably you're going to do a follow-up at some stage. Okay. So when you've cracked the puzzle and the early warning system is working really well, then we look forward to a snappy follow-up. Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks for the wonderful turnout, and thanks for the new faces. Thanks for the speakers.